Dean Martin was midway through a song, the kind that usually floated out of him like smoke from a cigarette, when he noticed something that didn't belong in a nightclub. It wasn't pointed at him, not yet. It wasn't waved around. It simply lay there on a table in the front row, heavy and unmistakable. A gun. The man sitting behind it was someone whose name was never spoken out loud in Las Vegas, only murmured when the music was loud enough to cover fear. Dean's voice faded. The band kept playing, unsure. The room froze, and in that suspended moment, Dean Martin made a choice that would either seal his legend or end his life. To understand why that moment mattered, you have to understand Las Vegas in 1965. This wasn't the polished, family-friendly desert playground people know today. It was a town run by organized crime, top to bottom. The hotels, the casinos, the showrooms, even the dealers and waitresses, all existed at the pleasure of men who never appeared on the marquee. The Sands Hotel, where Dean was performing, was one of their jewels. Performers knew the unspoken rules. You showed up, you entertained, you smiled, and you never challenged the people who truly owned the room. The Rat Pack understood this better than anyone. Sinatra had his own delicate arrangements. Sammy, Joey, Peter, they all navigated the invisible lines carefully. Dean did too, in his own way. But Dean Martin wasn't wired like most men. He grew up in Steubenville, Ohio, where organized crime wasn't a rumor, it was part of daily life. His father worked in a barber shop that doubled as an illegal gambling front. Dean learned early how tough men thought, how pride worked, how fear smelled. He also learned something else. If you let a bully see you flinch, you were finished. On stage, Dean carried none of the fear most people felt. Not because he thought he was invincible, but because he genuinely didn't care about pleasing anyone powerful. He sang because he loved it. He joked because it amused him. Approval was optional, and that attitude had carried him safely through decades in rough rooms. Until June 1965, decided to test it. 3 days before the incident, the warning arrived quietly. Dean was in his dressing room, relaxed, flipping through a magazine, when a knock came at the door. His assistant, Jackie Romano, opened it and immediately went pale. The man standing there wore an expensive suit, and the kind of calm that came from knowing he never had to raise his voice. He announced that Vincent Antonelli wanted to meet Dean after the show. Not asked. Wanted. Dean barely looked up. He told the messenger to pass along that he was tired and unavailable. The man didn't react. He said, Antonelli insisted. That's when Dean stood, walked to the door, and looked the man straight in the eyes. He told him to tell Vincent that if he wanted a meeting, he could come himself and ask like a gentleman. The messenger left. Jackie nearly came apart. Vincent Antonelli wasn't just connected. He was feared, even among his own kind. A man with a violent reputation and nothing to lose. When he called, people came running. Everyone except Dean Martin. The next night, the messenger returned. Vincent was waiting downstairs. Dean, already loosening his tie, smiled and said he'd left 10 minutes ago. When the man pointed out the obvious, Dean shrugged and explained that he was done working and going to bed. Jackie begged him to call Sinatra, to smooth things over. Dean refused. He wasn't dragging Frank into it. He wasn't apologizing for nothing. And he wasn't running. By the third day, the Sands was buzzing. Word spread that Vincent Antonelli was angry. Staff whispered warnings. Dean's manager pleaded with him, explaining that Vincent believed Dean had encouraged his girlfriend, a dancer, to leave Vegas for Hollywood. Dean laughed. He'd never met her. It didn't matter. Vincent believed it. Dean still refused to apologize for something he hadn't done. On June 18th, the tension was thick enough to taste. Dean arrived early. Security hovered. Jackie burst into the dressing room with panic in his eyes. Vincent had bought out the first 3 rows. 20 men, front and center. Dean calmly adjusted his bow tie and said if they paid for tickets, they were just audience members. At 9 p.m. sharp, Dean Martin walked onto the stage. He spotted them instantly. Dark suits, hard faces, and Vincent Antonelli staring straight through him. Dean smiled, welcomed the crowd, and launched into his opening number. The applause came from everywhere except the front rows. Dean joked about it, needling just enough to make people nervous. Halfway through the next song, Vincent slowly reached into his jacket. The room tightened, but it was only a cigarette. He lit it without breaking eye contact. Then he drew his finger across his throat. Dean stopped singing. Silence swallowed the room. 2,000 people held their breath. And then Dean smiled. He stepped to the edge of the stage, addressed the crowd, and casually suggested that the gentleman in the front row seemed eager to express himself. He walked closer. He knelt. He held out the microphone to Vincent Antonelli and invited him to come up and sing. The audacity was staggering. This was the moment where men usually disappeared. Vincent stared at him, weighing life and death. And then, impossibly, he laughed. A cold laugh, but real. He told Dean he had guts. Dean joked back. Vincent waved him off and told him to keep singing. And just like that, the threat dissolved. Dean finished the show like nothing had happened. Vincent and his men applauded at the end. Later, Vincent came alone to Dean's dressing room. They drank scotch. Vincent explained the misunderstanding. He admitted Dean hadn't scared him, but he respected him. Most men would have folded. Dean hadn't. They shook hands. The line was drawn, and so was the respect. By morning, the story had exploded across Las Vegas. The legend grew with each telling. Guns, fights, confrontations that never happened. But the truth was better. One man refused to be intimidated. Another recognized strength when he saw it. Dean Martin never bragged about it. He shrugged it off, said he just didn't want anyone ruining his show. But everyone who was there knew the truth. That night, Dean Martin wasn't playing cool. He was cool. And in a city ruled by fear, that made him untouchable. The days after that night unfolded quietly on the surface, but underneath Las Vegas shifted just a little, the way sand moves after a heavy step. Dean went back to his routine. Late mornings, rehearsals, cigarettes, drinks that may or may not have been watered down, and shows that sold out without effort. Yet something had changed in the way people looked at him. Dealers nodded with more respect. Managers spoke more carefully, and even men who usually avoided eye contact now met his gaze and smiled, because word had traveled fast in a town built on whispers. The message was simple and dangerous. Dean Martin was not a man you pushed. Vincent Antonelli kept his distance after that, not out of fear, but out of acknowledgement, the kind that only exists between men who understand power without needing to prove it. Occasionally, Vincent would appear again in the front row, impeccably dressed, applauding louder than anyone else, almost as if reminding the room that what happened that night was settled business. Dean never spoke about it publicly, never turned it into a story for interviews or television, because for him it wasn't a stunt or a moral victory. It was instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive long before fame ever found him. Frank Sinatra eventually laughed it off too, but not before admitting that Dean had done something few people could pull off and survive. Years later, when Vegas began to change, when corporate money replaced mob money, and the town cleaned itself up for tourists and families, old-timers would still bring up that night at the Sands, lowering their voices as if Vincent might still be listening. They talked about how courage didn't roar or threaten, how sometimes it smiled, told a joke, and offered a microphone. When Vincent Antonielli was killed years later in a mob hit that had nothing to do with Dean, the news barely touched him, except for a quiet remark that Vincent had been tough but fair, which was about as close as Dean ever came to sentiment. The microphone from that night was never framed or displayed, never turned into a relic, but its meaning lingered because it represented something rare in that era. A performer who understood the danger, acknowledged it, and refused to kneel anyway. In a city where power was enforced with fear, Dean Martin showed that calm could be stronger than intimidation, that confidence could disarm violence, and that sometimes the bravest move wasn't to fight or flee, but to stand exactly where you were and invite the threat to reveal itself. That was the real continuation of the story. Not the applause, not the legend, but the quiet understanding that from that night forward, Dean Martin didn't just belong on the Las Vegas stage, he owned it. And that ownership followed him for the rest of his life. Not in contracts or titles, but in presence. The kind you can't fake and can't steal. Long after the Sands closed and the Rat Pack became history, musicians and comics would still mention Dean in hushed admiration, not just for his voice or timing, but for that unshakable calm. He had proven that real authority didn't come from threats, money, or violence, but from knowing exactly who you were and refusing to be moved. On that night in 1965, Dean Martin didn't challenge the mob or try to dominate them. He simply stayed himself, and that was enough. That's why the story never really ended. It just kept echoing whenever someone stepped on a stage and chose courage over fear.